So I want you to imagine that there's a restaurant that you go to all the time. It's your old favorite, you've been going there for years, all your friends and family go there, you love it. You can't get enough of it. And one day you get this hankering for this shrimp dish that they do just right. The hostess greets you at the door by name and shows you to your regular seat. You look around and recognize all the familiar faces of people chatting over their meals. You catch a few eyes, you throw a few waves and nods. Everything feels normal. The waiter comes by and drops the menus and takes your drink order. You open up the menu and immediately your stomach sinks. It's all different. You don't recognize anything, and that shrimp thing that you came for isn't even on the menu. The waiter comes back with your drinks and you ask what happened. Why is the menu all different? The waiter assures you nothing's wrong, nothing's changed. And you point out that the shrimp thing is gone. The friendly smile drains from his face and there's a slight tension in his eyes. He tells you they never had it on the menu, that you must be thinking of some other restaurant. You tell him you'll need a few more minutes and he goes back. You look around the dining room and you think that maybe you misjudged the atmosphere when you first walked in. Nobody actually seems happy. They're all just staring at each other and methodically shoveling food into their mouths. At the table next to you, it's one of your neighbors, Frank. He's sitting with his wife and his 2 kids. You get his attention and lean over and whisper, "Hey Frank, what's up with this?" You gesture to the menu and you nod to the dining room. Frank looks at you with a blank stare and he says he doesn't know what you're talking about. You tell him about the different menu and you know for a fact that he used to order the shrimp thing too. He pauses and he looks at you like you're crazy. He tells you he just always orders the special. It's obvious he doesn't want to talk about this. His wife shoots him an angry look. He turns his attention back to his own table and you're left with a deeply unsettling feeling. What you don't know is that there are new owners that took over the restaurant, and they don't want anyone to know that it's under new ownership. They've instructed the staff not to tell anybody. They don't want to alienate their regulars because they need them. Everyone else in the dining room is just there out of habit. They're too tired and too busy to notice any changes, even if they're huge ones. My argument right now is that this restaurant is the new Democratic Party.
Seeing the world through a blazing gaslight, nowhere to run, don't know who to fight. The deep state's taking over, baby, pull up a chair. Headed for the one world order and nobody cares. They tell me the truth is just a matter of taste, and the facts on your phone change at a digital pace. Your algorithm loves you, it knows what you need. A warm cup of outrage waiting in your feed. The propagandists propagate, the grifters grift on, and by 9 in the morning real thinking is gone. It's a beautiful mess, kid, a glorious spin. Your truth today was picked by the algorithm. Some bot wrote the headline, some bot wrote the fear. Welcome to Rumination Nation, we've been expecting you here.
So welcome to Rumination Nation. It's a little channel where we like to sit around and fixate and obsess and try to understand the topics of the day, try to understand things a little better and form grounded, worthy opinions on different ideas. Or not. Just stop talking to people, live your life online, get a couple more dogs, whatever. But this rumination is going to be about how one of the 2 parties that we have, the only 2 parties that we have, is flat broke. A third of their voters hate them. 57% of the country believe they've lost touch with reality and can't raise any money and are somehow still winning elections. So 100 days before the midterms, the DNC goes into the bank and mortgages a building that they work out of to make payroll. And they ask vendors not to send any bills until after the midterms. They're $2 million in debt and about $500 million behind the Republicans. Now, the DNC chair, Ken Martin, said the donors would come back as soon as they started winning elections. While they have started winning some elections, the donors seem to not have come back. And on top of that, given Trump's massive unpopularity, combined with historical midterm trends, they should be on track for one of the biggest blue waves in history. But instead, there's actually speculation that it'll be a struggle for them to win the House. The reason for this, I'm going to let you know a little secret, is the fierce internal struggle by 2 minority groups within the Democratic Party to be the base that dictates policy. On the one hand, you have the wealthy capitalists, and on the other hand, you have the professional managerial class. The working class base are merely foot soldiers to go out and do their bidding and vote for their policies. There's been a gradual movement over decades, and sometime between 2012 and 2016, it became the de facto structure of the party. Now, to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the basic idea that is still batted around, and often that it's the Democratic Party that's the party of the working class. In 1996, 60% of Bill Clinton's voters were white people without college degrees. Joe Biden's share of that vote was only 27%. Harris did slightly better with about 29%. This slide coincided with the voters of color who have drifted from the party by about 32 points since 2012. The idea of the limousine liberal, that's an idea that I used to scoff at, has now actually become a reality. The party of the affluent and educated is also funded by the affluent donors. But these 2 groups are a distinct minority of the country, but also a minority of the party itself. The 3% of Americans are millionaires, and 45% of all political donors are millionaires. In 2016, the percent of Trump's donors who were millionaires was about 27%. Clinton's, 42%. There was one study done by David Brookman and Neil Mahorta. They ran the largest survey of American donors ever conducted and compared them to ordinary voters in the same party. And what they found is that Democratic donors are dramatically more liberal than the rank-and-file Democrats, but specifically on social and cultural issues, not on economics. Can you guess why? Now, just to give you a quick example from the study, it's the death penalty. 80% of ordinary Democrats support it, and only 40% of donors support it. So the people writing the checks seemingly live in a different moral universe than the people casting the votes. Now, in 2018, when Democrats retook the House, the party's net favorability was a +1. Skip ahead to 2026, and they're underwater by 26 points. 57% of voters now call the party too liberal. But it's important to reiterate that we're talking on social and cultural issues because these same donors are also opposed to many of the more populist economic policies that had won over the working people for decades before. So the working class isn't just being spoon-fed social reform they think goes too far, but also being handed an economic policy that A, doesn't really exist, and what little's talked about doesn't benefit them in any way. Because affluent voters place little concern on immediate material concerns like the cost of groceries and gas and border security and local crime rates. I mean, remember when inflation was actually not that big of a deal under Biden, and now it's the worst thing in the world under Trump? So while the donors are full speed ahead on cultural issues, they've completely hit the brakes on any sort of economic issues. A study from USC Law pointed out that both parties rely and cater to the wealthy donor class, and the average voter is left out without any sort of populist alternative. This transition has been a slow burn, and if you've watched my channel before, you know the thesis is backed with a lot of facts that the middle class have been hollowed out by immigration and free trade, and the unions dramatically weakened, and so Democrats had to rely on big businesses to fund their campaigns. For the most part, big businesses don't really care about the culture war issue, so there's just kind of an unspoken thing that you can do whatever you want in that area. But in terms of economics, don't touch anything. So this put them in a pretty tough spot because they couldn't offer their working class base anything on that front. But luckily, with social media coming out around the same time as the official transition took place, they were able to draw their attention away from the fact that they had nothing to offer. They could reframe their old populist stances like being anti-free trade, strict border enforcement, and going after people who employ undocumented workers into moral issues. The things that they had supported for decades are now morally bad, and the bad people want those things. It's not hard to find some of your favorite Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid, Barack Obama, holding views on these policies back in the 90s and early 2000s that today would be considered far right-wing. Back then, they were doing it to protect the working and middle class, but those measures are completely contrary to their donor base now. So all those things which were definitely not happening 20 years ago, like importing cheap labor and exporting good-paying jobs, are happening now, and those are actually good things. The consequences of this are the vast majority of Americans aren't even allowed to discuss these topics in public. See the 2016 campaign when you had Bernie running on these issues, and he got called sexist and racist for his troubles. Lack of policy discussion was so bad in 2016 that the Wellesley Media Project, which is a nonpartisan project that studies media usage in campaigns, said in their report that Hillary Clinton was unwilling to discuss policy of any kind both in and outside campaign ads. They found that over 80% of her campaign ads focused on ad hominem attacks on Trump's fitness to be president, while over 70% of his ads compared and contrasted his stances against hers on policy. Now, for frame of reference, in 2012, 70% of Barack Obama's ads centered around the economy. Her only counterattack to Trump's economic populism that had been the bread and butter of her own party less than a decade earlier was personal tax and drawing people's attention to overly symbolic policies. It's her time, that was the campaign slogan. She came to represent the new party insofar that all messaging was built around symbolic advancement of privileged people, getting more women and people of color into the C-suite while telling the janitor who cleans the C-suite to go fuck himself or herself if they don't like it. They touted the wage gap that doesn't really exist, at least in the way that can be legislated around it. Remember that 77 cents on the dollar figure that was thrown around back then? Now, the way they came up with the 77 cents on the dollar figure is that they took all the money that all the women made and all the money that all the men made, and as the denominator, they used it of all the working age women and all the working age men. Now, the problem with that is that there are a lot of women who choose not to be in the workforce. That's their right. They can choose to do that. So that brings down the average. So that's a big chunk of that 77 cents. And then it also didn't take into consideration hours worked. On average, men work about 4.5 hours more than women. So the only way that you can legislate around that is by forcing women who don't want to work to go to work, and by forcing men who want to work more hours to not work those hours. It's a zombie policy that just keeps coming back, and it's used to rile people up and get them to demand change, while knowing full well they can't do anything about it, other than, like I said, forcing women to work and forcing men to work fewer hours. It reminds me of this old story, it might be apocryphal, of the Kennedy campaign. They campaigned on a missile gap, a growing missile gap, because Russia was outpacing our missile production. Kennedy wins the election, they get into office, and he asks one of his aides to look into the missile gap. And they come back with the information, and there is no missile gap. We're actually outpacing the Russians. And he said, how could this be? And they said, well, that was just something we made up for the campaign, and we just kind of started believing it ourselves. Interesting. So that to me, the wage gap and the missile gap are kind of like the same thing. It was words used purely to create a reality that would rile people up and get them on board. The other thing they do now is they talk about raising minimum wage, which seems like a good first-order thinking policy, but once you see that massive companies like Amazon and Walmart that rely on lower-skilled workers actually support legislatively raising minimum wage, and then you start looking into the second-order effects, you see it's a medium to long-term play to kill potential competitors in the crib and run them out of business until they're the only game in town, and then at that point they can just dictate terms of how much they're going to pay you. So while these mirage-like policies are still cynically batted around, the emergence of Donald Trump and his brash and coarse rhetoric worked perfectly to build up a negative partisan framework where they didn't need to come up with any ideas or policies, they could just attack Trump and his supporters. Being a Democrat has increasingly come to mean that you roughly are against anything that Trump comes up with, even if it's a policy that you would have supported as an Obama voter. And using tribalism and social media to reframe the entire political landscape as a fight for democracy itself, to keep people terrified of the opposing party, that's a great smokescreen to maintain some kind of relevancy and support while avoiding the economic reforms your donors don't want. What makes this all the more frustrating is that the exit is visible from this room. Economic populism that made America what it is in the 20th century, but that's precisely what the donor class is fighting against. The real problem facing Democrats and the party as a whole is that Trump isn't going to be on the ballot in 2028, and they still haven't come up with a cogent economic message. Seth Moulton, a congressman from Massachusetts, said in a recent interview that the party has no ideas and has a tendency to wash over problems and not address the real concerns that voters have. When the centrist establishment hollows out its economic platform to appease wealthy donors, it creates a hell of a vacuum, which is where the DSA comes in. Predominantly white, wealthy, and highly ideological, they've grown up in a world that's insulated them from accountability and even ideas that don't align with their Marxist professors. Katie Wilson, the newly elected mayor in Seattle, has seen her tax plan lead to a loss of 30,000 jobs, and the commercial occupancy rate of Seattle is now 35%. Now that's as a direct result of businesses leaving the city because of her agenda, because of her policies. And then you have good old Mayor Mamdani. He's implementing rent control, a policy with an easily referenced track record of failure that's already driving up the cost of living. City-run supermarkets that have been tried and failed in other cities that will drive regular supermarkets out of business, and by the time the city supermarkets fail, the entire city could be a food desert. They resort to these zombie policies because they were brought up learning that these things kept failing historically because they weren't implemented correctly, or there was meddling by external capitalist forces, or poor planning. But this time we can get it right. And this is where I believe that every aspect of the new Democratic parties or the new left stances are uniquely anti-science. While it's the party that loves to tell you trust the science, it explicitly rejects the foundation of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis. If it fails, the tested hypothesis is wrong and you move on to a better one. Instead, the failure is either ignored or blamed on something else. It would have worked if only. Well, if only my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bike. The problem this introduces to the party is that you now have two wings. The establishment with no ideas and the DSA with bad ideas. The DSA is gaining ground because it's at least offering an alternative economic message. It's hamstrung by radical policies like defund the police, abolish prisons, abolish the Constitution. Nobody who hasn't been subjected to modern higher education indoctrination believes any of these things are good. Now the DSA has gained some ground, and you face a scenario where the establishment candidate is going to alienate DSA voters, who happen to be largely upper middle class and privileged and white, and also the working class because the establishment doesn't have anything to offer them. The DSA candidate is going to alienate the establishment because the establishment doesn't want them taking their shit. The DSA will also alienate the working class because for the most part, they're not an unaccountable class. They know the cause and effect outcomes of the DSA's economic policies, and they're the ones who have to suffer for their social policies. I mean, think about the defund the police movement. That was largely opposed by people working and living in high crime areas. Gallup found that the majority of people in those areas wanted more police presence. But the message from the Democrats was, too bad, we know better. So now, by default, any candidate the Democrats nominate in 2028 is going to alienate a big chunk of the base. And all of this happened because Democrats hollowed out their own base with anti-working class policies in the 90s, which led them to rely and cater to big business interests a decade and a half later. The reason the Democrats can't raise money is because people with the money know better. The reason they're so unpopular and so underwater compared to 2018 is because they've been ideologically taken over by radical NGOs that have no accountability in their lives whatsoever. They've grown up privileged and they've never faced any consequences. Any bad idea that they have isn't bad, it's just never given a fair shot. Any failure can be met with an excuse that just kind of pushes accountability and blame off to somebody else. The only way the Democrats are going to right themselves is by starting to elect people who actually make sense and are going to be a little bit tougher on big businesses. So that's what I got for today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.